Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, the first Cision UK and Brandwatch collaboration. My name is Barnaby Barron. I'm the head of UK Insights at Cision, and I'm pleased to be joined by Senior Solutions Strategist at Brandwatch, Alistair Wheat.
Hi there.
Today, we're both excited to bring you the Strategic Dream Team, how PR and social media mutually benefit each other. A webinar where we'll be exploring the interplay between traditional PR and social media and how you can make the most out of this relationship in terms of insights and strategy. Thanks for joining us, and we hope you enjoy. Now, before we dive into it, I'd like to mention some housekeeping bits. You'll see a Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Please fire in your questions to both of us throughout, and we'll try and get to as many of them as possible at the end. We're also tweeting using the hashtag #TheStrategicDreamTeam, as you can see on the screen. Please get involved with the conversation, share your thoughts, comments on social. Our handles are there as well, so feel free to ask us any questions we may not get to during the webinar. Happy to continue the conversation after we're done. And finally, as always, an in-demand copy of the recording will be made available afterwards for anyone who's not been able to join us live. So let's kind of jump into things. I'll introduce myself very briefly. My name's Barney. I'm the head of Insights here at UK, here in the UK for Cision. Been at Cision for 8.5 years. And actually, Alistair, who's joining me, he's kind of returned to the Cision family. We used to work together when he was at Cision before. So Alistair, I'll let you say a couple of words.
Yeah, so hi everyone. I began my career in this space about 16 years ago at a company that did online news monitoring. And back then, social media was just blogs and forums. Obviously, things have changed a lot since then. I've also worked in a company that did online newsrooms. Then got bought by NASDAQ. And I then joined Gorkana, where I was head of digital, and I worked with Barney. And then we were brought into the Cision family. And since then, I've been at a company called Analytica doing online influencer marketing. And then I've joined Brandwatch, and I'm back at Cision. So we're back at one big happy family again. So I've had about sort of 10 years or more working directly with comms and PR people, often introducing them to the world of social. And then more recently, I've been focusing really on the marketing and social insight side. So hopefully it can add a bit of perspective to both sides of the equation in this webinar today. So thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Alistair. So we're going to cover a few things in this webinar. I want to start off by kind of talking in broad terms why PR professionals should really care about social and what's going on there, and also vice versa. I think a lot of people are bought into that idea, but from experience, maybe not everyone I speak to is. So we want to talk a bit about that. And then we want to talk through a few different examples, case studies of where brands have used social media to inform their PR or comms strategy, and try and make that as real and as actionable for you guys as possible. And then, yeah, towards the end, we'll have a decent chunk of time to answer your questions. So I wanted to start off with actually this very broad definition of what is PR from the CIPR. And they say that public relations is the discipline which looks after reputation with the aim of earning understanding and support and influencing opinion and behavior. If we really focus on that influencing opinion and behavior piece. Now, obviously a key way in which PR professionals influence opinion and behavior is through earned media, whether that be digital, print, broadcast, whatever it is. But there is a much more complex story to tell here, where interacting with social, interacting directly with companies influences people's behaviors. So if we think about everything that can impact on customer opinion, we've not just got earned media, we've got social media, how they're interacting with brands on social, advertising that they may see, word of mouth, direct experience, competitor experience as well. So if PR professionals are, as we saw on the previous slide, really responsible for understanding, supporting, or earning understanding and supporting and influencing opinion and behavior, being focused on earned media, whether that be digital, print, broadcast, etc., is very kind of narrow-sighted, and you're missing lots of different areas in which people and consumers are having their opinions formed about brands, companies, organizations, charities, whatever it might be. And I think kind of more than ever now, see, social doesn't just play a part in that, it feeds that loop as well. So Alistair.
Yeah, just to add on to that, as Brian was just saying, people are getting all sorts of inputs from various different sources that affect their view of a brand or organization. But also the way that relationship is evolved has meant that brands need to be quicker and more adaptive and aware of what's going on. The public are increasingly expecting brands to be listening to social and being aware of what's going on. And that is then going to affect how brands respond. So just to give a couple of examples, recently in the UK, where brands have been caught out a little bit by the sort of pace of online discussions, and often this is very much the case in the US and other markets as well. But in the UK, there's been a new news channel that's launched recently called GB News, which is a more right-leaning news site. Some people have said it's trying to be the Fox News of the UK. And a lot of people haven't liked particularly much the content that's coming out on GB News, and have been then looking at which brands have been advertising on GB News and then targeting those brands online and saying, hey, are you sponsoring hate? Do you share these kind of repulsive views? And then people on the right complaining if they see a brand pulling their advertising from it and saying they should boycott it. So there's a lot of this discussion about brands and about how people expect them to behave. And a couple of times brands have then, the person on social who's been atted in these conversations has replied going and say, oh, we don't support these views. But often that's not been then done in a way that's been linked up with the comms team and the rest of the business. And then the rest of the business has put out a press release later on stating something that might contradict what the person managing the social feed said. And it just kind of spins into this very complicated, convoluted cycle. So it's increasingly difficult, I think, for brands to kind of just completely stay out of these conversations. There's often a need for them to be really listening and thinking ahead. What might we say if the situation comes up? Let's hope it doesn't come up, but we're probably going to get sucked into some of these discussions as well. And also, you can't just let one part of the business just go ahead and pump adverts around or pass them off to an agency without maybe giving them some guidance about, just be careful about advertising here, here, and here, because we've seen that other brands are getting blowback because their ads, and it might not just be worth the hassle. So rather than advertising in a place and then having to be put on the spot about our position about whether we should pull out from advertising there, maybe best not to advertise there in the first place, to not get, really caught up in an argument that we would rather not be involved in. The other challenge as well is that where we might think the public consciousness is heading on a particular topic can shift, and this is increasingly so because of the whole pandemic. So, for example, on issues to do with the environment, we know people care about recycling and waste, but often those priorities have shifted somewhat due to the pandemic. So a lot of times people have maybe said, well, actually my main concern is this going to protect me from the virus? Is this going to be a high efficacy? I don't mind if I actually end up throwing some extra waste and rubbish away. I don't mind getting loads of extra plastic in if it means I can get tested. So consumer priorities shift, and often that shift will be more evident in social than it will in other sources. Surveys and things can have a lag and they can take time. So that's, I think, another area where social needs to be really brought into the PR comms mix, and vice versa, that the comms team needs to be thinking strategically long-term about how the brand conducts itself in other areas like digital advertising and the social channels. So fast-moving landscape. It's been the case for a long time that brands need to care about social, but the pace of change has meant that this has become, I think, something that really mandates increasingly joined up processes from some of the brands. Just to say as well that if we are getting questions that, well, can everyone hear us okay? So if anyone has any questions, we will be coming to a Q&A session at the end. So it might be better if you've got a question that you want us to answer properly than to put it in the Q&A panel, just to make that point as well. So we will try and keep an eye on the chat, but if you have a bigger, more meaty question, then put that in the Q&A panel. So back to you, Lonnie.
Cool, thanks for that. And I think this actually starts to touch a little bit on that question that came through. Alistair's kind of talked there how social can drive news, and even maybe news that you don't necessarily want to be involved with, but having a company purpose is really clear and very important. Also, increasingly, social is the go-to source for news and information for lots of different people. This data actually comes from Reuters Institute digital news report. They release it every year. If it's not something you've read, I can strongly encourage you to go and read it. It's got loads of really important and interesting information about media landscape, the social landscape versus the digital or traditional landscape. So worthwhile read for any comms professional. And one of the things that I think is really striking in here is the usage of different social platforms, but not just the kind of weekly usage. What we have here is we're looking at the weekly news usage. So participants are asked how, if they are using these social platforms on a weekly basis to access, share, understand news that relates to them. And, across the board, there's huge numbers of people who are using these different platforms on a very frequent basis to access news information. Now, as a PR pro, what we're talking about here is reach towards potentially tens of millions of different people. And, if you had publications like the BBC or the Mail Online, they're actually reaching potentially less people than these huge social platforms, specifically from a news perspective. So really underlines the importance that you need to have when you're considering not just the news that you're producing, but how shareable is that news on social media? How is it going to get to social media? Are you posting it directly? Are you expecting amplification from traditional news, etc.? Lots of interesting considerations for when you're thinking about social. I think one of the mistakes that I will often see, I was talking to Alistair about this earlier on, is people, particularly from a comms side, will think of social as this kind of amorphous blob and this checkbox of we need to make sure social's included. But actually, if you look at how we treat social and look at the different results on social, what you see is that the conversation in Reddit will be very different to the conversation on Twitter or the conversation on Facebook, for example. So you need to think about how you're hitting those channels specifically. And to kind of answer the question here, what this means is this 44% means that 44% of people who were asked are using Facebook on a weekly basis to get on at least a weekly basis to get news and information. So kind of considering those different social channels and considering the age and the audiences that are using them. So see, TikTok, Snap skew much younger, so your audiences there are different. So if you're producing content that you want to resonate on that platform, that needs to be distinctly different to content that may be placed on Facebook to resonate with an older audience, for example. And we kind of talked about why some of these things are important. I want to show this statistic, which comes from a piece of research Cision did with the CMO Council. CMO Council is the Chief Marketing Officers Council. We asked CMOs how many of them are currently integrating and amplifying earned media and marketing. In the purpose of this study, marketing kind of included social as well. I know that's not always the case in all organizations, but 36% of respondents said that they don't currently integrate and amplify earned media and their marketing. Now that's a huge number. I think if we were to also ask the practitioners, so the people carrying out that activity, that number might even go up. So whilst I think there's a general acceptance that best practice includes integration of earned media, social media, etc., we're still a ways away from that happening on a consistent, regular basis for a lot of brands and a lot of organizations. So kind of still work there to be done. And what we're going to move on, Alistair's going to talk about this, is kind of some guidelines of how we can think about doing that. And then we'll kind of move into some more of the case studies that we have to look at.
Yeah, so we've talked about how people are getting news from different sources. The other thing that we need to think about with what we can get from looking at social is a better understanding of people's thoughts, their feelings, their emotions, as well as what's being shared. So with comms people, what is being done is having an agenda to send out comms about what your business is doing. But often that might involve then, especially more in sort of health or public services business teams, thinking about how to bring about a kind of custom public information campaign or to change behavior, but that will also be true for brands. So with social, there's an opportunity to get a better sense of, in a much quicker time frame, what people are thinking and feeling and how they're reacting to the news. So if we were to look at this from an insights perspective for a business that was wanting to plan product innovation, those things will often take a long time to do, and there'll be lots of research, there'll be time to do surveys, there'll be time to do panels, and lots of kind of in-depth traditional market research. But in the comms space, often there'll need to be a much quicker reaction, and therefore social insights is a way to get a finger on the pulse of what's going on. Of course, you do need to be mindful that if you're just looking, for example, at Twitter, what's being said can often be skewed. It isn't necessarily going to represent the wider population. But depending on the sector, there are good places to look, for example, in forums or in Reddit, if it's like a financial conversation, where people who are able to post anonymously might be more open and honest about their views on certain topics. So with comms teams, the important thing here is to think about how can we use social as a way of getting the reaction of the consumer, getting the thoughts and feelings of the consumer or the public, and how to factor that into our comms planning. So we'll come back to that in a moment. But this isn't just about getting eyeballs on your content and trying to think about what people are reacting to. We can also dig into themes, look beyond the brand. Don't just look at brand mentions, look at topics and issues as well as brand mentions to get an idea of how you as a business to communicate.
Great. So let's move on to a few kind of case studies that we have of where we've taken some social data and that's been used to inform PR strategies. So I think that's what we really want to see. One of the great examples, something that is frequently used, I think it is something that I see used as a metric, but maybe not used as much as it could be for insights, is social sharing and how much particular content is being shared on social media. Social sharing is a really good indicator for a leading indicator for what people are interested in. So social sharing is, in most cases, will be a function of the number of people who have read a particular article. So last year, I think we all knew, we all experienced it, that we were getting sick of reading coverage about the coronavirus. And that was certainly an experience that lots of people had. Looking at social sharing, we can actually see the data behind that validate that people were getting less interested in reading coronavirus coverage, and then subsequently coverage around that dropped off. Now, as a PR professional, that tells you, hey, this is when we want to be in this conversation because people are talking about it and engaging with it frequently, and then this is where we don't want to be in this conversation. So what I have here is I've got a chart over time. Actually, I've just realized my axis labels are the wrong way around here. So the orange is actually the social sharing, and the teal is the volume of coverage. And what we have here is the rolling average of volume of content and social sharing of that content that mentions coronavirus. And what you can see quite clearly here is that at the beginning of last year, that coverage talking about coronavirus increases over time through to maybe the middle of May, when it starts to drop off. But what we see when we look at the social sharing is that for social sharing, we see that volume of sharing significantly spike right towards the kind of third week of March, which is obviously, as all of us will fondly remember, when we had to go into the first lockdown. And then after around 3 or 4 weeks, we see that volume significantly drop off, and you can see subsequent increases at later points, but generally a downtrend in the social sharing of that content. So as a comms professional, what that tells me is there is a point where coronavirus was very highly engaged with content, very prominently read content. That then drops off after 3 or 4 weeks. But then there's a big lag, so it takes maybe a month longer until that coverage starts to decline. Now, this is one example for coronavirus, but this same approach can be taken for any brand looking at any particular topics. So if you're maybe a big tech brand and you want to talk about digital transformation, AI, machine learning, all of these different topics, what you're able to do is see which topics are getting shared and engaged with on social to help inform the type of language and messaging that you should deliver within your editorial, your earned media coverage that you're trying to drive. And then the next example that we have, this is from some analysis that we did, that Joel J in my team at Cision did around E3. And this is a really great way of seeing maybe beyond the volume, some of the vanity metrics, as people will often call them, to understand maybe audience resonance with your particular stories. So E3, for those who don't know, is a really big gaming expo that happens every year in the US. And at that expo, lots of different gaming companies will have big announcements where they'll talk about what games are coming up for their consoles in the next 12 months. Now, both Nintendo and Xbox had big announcements at E3 like they do every year. And we looked at kind of two different things or different aspects of their announcements and their news coverage. And what you see for Nintendo is that they drove a much larger news cycle, both in news and social, where they had more coverage, they had a higher share of voice compared to Xbox. But then what we did is we identified people who were Nintendo fans on social media and people who were Xbox fans on social media. That's something that's really easy to do. You can just search for people who are frequently tweeting about these brands or engaging with these brands, following them, etc. So you can create an audience of Nintendo fans and Xbox fans. And then we did an analysis of how they specifically responded to the news conferences from these two companies. And, both groups of fans responded well. Nintendo fans, 40% of all the Nintendo fans who tweeted about E3 or had a social conversation around E3 exhibited joy to the announcements that Nintendo made. Xbox fans, we actually had 53% of them who joined the conversation in social and exhibited joy. And what this is a great way of kind of going beyond just the sentiment that you will see in news coverage. Journalists, particularly if they're reporting announcements or things that, product features that you've announced, whatever it is, you're going to have 95%, or in most cases, you're going to have 95% positive or neutral coverage. And in these cases, we have actual fans responding positively. And it can also help you understand or help you report on the targeting that you're potentially doing. So it may be that you just want to drive as much noise as possible and you want to get the news out there of particular new games that are coming out. in which case you probably want that highest share of voice as possible. It may be that what you really want to do is engage your core fan base, get them really excited about your new products, your new games that have coming out. And, you know, Xbox clearly did a good job or a better job at doing that than Nintendo potentially did with this announcement. So that's one of the other ways that I think we can use social as earned media professionals to understand actually how people are reacting to our announcements, rather than a lot of traditional media analysis will just look at how journalists have reacted to our announcements, which doesn't necessarily represent how audiences have reacted. And then another example that we have here, I really love this example, kind of using social for consumer research to understand how we should be talking to our potential audiences. So what we have here is we've just searched social media for the term "I need to diet" in the UK. And what we can do there is then split that conversation between different audiences, different demographics, to understand the different ways in which people are talking about dieting. So, you know, the dieting conversation, or people saying "I need to diet," does skew slightly female, so 2/3 female, 1/3 male, which means that on this right-hand side, then we're looking at a word cloud of key topics skewing more female and skewing more male. Now, because more of the conversation is female, it means that probably where Diet Coke is around the midpoint. So anything beyond that is more male. Anything the other side is more female. And what you see here is really interesting results. So if I'm, you know, a brand like Weight Watchers or Slimming World, for example, and I think we want to engage with more men, we want to get more men signing up to, you know, our programs and our services, then what I can understand by looking at these types of results is that, you know, when females are talking about dieting, there seems to be, you know, more emotive conversation. When men are talking about it, it tends to be, you know, more practical in terms of specific types of diet, keto diet, plant-based diet, etc. And what that tells you is that there can be specific approaches. So your messaging to men obviously needs to be different to your messaging to women, obviously makes sense. But by listening to what people are saying, by basically what we've done is searched for in order to find out other terms people are using around those phrases. And yeah, that can then inform our messaging towards men, how that looks versus our messaging towards women, etc. And then the kind of last example that I have, then I'm going to pass on to Alistair. He's going to go in depth into more specifics. It's just journalist dissonance. Now, this is something we're seeing more and more in some of the analysis that we're doing. If you look on social, I mean, I think it's something we know, but see, journalists represent their own views in social media, whereas they represent the publication in articles that they produce. And this is represented by the fact 11% of journalists in the UK state that their views are their own or similar in their Twitter bios. And by tracking their social conversation, we can have a more accurate understanding of their opinion on social. Now, there's a couple of examples that I've seen for this. I didn't want to put them up here because of some of the companies covered, etc. But there was one example we saw for a brand who had announced some new products and some new features. And if you look at the journalists who wrote that coverage, they wrote positive articles, they had great headlines, and they covered the announcement. If you then look at what that journalist said on social, in a couple of cases, the journalist said that the press release they received was very poorly written. And what that does is it directly informs what our relationship should be with that journalist. So there's often a huge amount of analysis that will go on for particular journalists in terms of the content that they're reading. And that similar analysis should happen with those journalists on social to see what they're talking about, how should we engage with them? If we've engaged with them, have they then tweeted about that? Has it been positive, etc.? That's one place where kind of crossing between social and traditional can really have an impact on how your journalist outreach is working. Great. So I'm going to throw over to Alistair now. He's going to go over an example in a bit more detail than the few that I've just been through.
Yeah, thanks, Bonnie. So gone through a few examples already, and the points Bonnie just made actually fit well into this cycle here. And any of you who are familiar with AMEC, the Association for the Measurement and Evaluation of Communications, will be familiar with this sort of workflow, which is the kind of recommended best practice for how to plan a comms campaign, to prepare, plan, implement, monitor, measure, and then iterate. So that's the kind of AMEC cycle. And often, well, I've seen this unfortunately too many times, and I know Barney has as well, where social in the kind of comms space is often just a little bolt on at the end of a kind of an evaluation report. So it's like, we've planned our campaign, we've gone and done it, we've got some analysis back, we're mainly focused on the news coverage that we've got because that's our kind of main KPI, but we need a bit of social. So let's stick a couple of slides in at the end of the report saying, here's our social volumes, and then maybe here's our share volumes. And that's kind of, the social box ticked. Whereas actually there's a whole lot more that can be done with social throughout this whole process. So right at the very beginning, social can be used to help prepare and plan what a campaign should actually say, how you should say it, when you should say it, who you should target, which influencers can you get involved in helping to promote it. Another thing as well is that often when PR people think about analysis or about getting some content in, they're often thinking within the restraints of traditional news. So there's often a difficulty maybe getting a hold of that content. There's licensing restrictions, there are costs to getting the content. Often news analysis might be done using kind of human analysis. And the thought of then trying to just broaden that out to loads of competitors, broaden that out to themes, will maybe lead to them thinking this is going to be very expensive. But actually, this is one of the great things with Social Insights, is it allows you to have a look at a much broader range of competitors, a much broader range of peers who are maybe not competitors, but trying to do similar things as far as a communication strategy is concerned. You can also then just listen to topics. You can listen to different audiences. And we had a question about how do you know whether a particular social channel is skewed? So there are, for example, surveys that look at how much a particular social channel represents general population. And so in certain channels like Facebook will be older, Twitter younger, and then platforms like Instagram and TikTok younger still. And so there's also different types of people that be on those platforms, but also then when people are talking about you on those platforms, that group that's talking about you might not represent that platform as a whole anyway. There might be a particular network that's really passionate about a particular topic, and they're very active, more so than they are about other themes. So social is a cost-effective and timely way to give you, as the comms professional, access to a whole range of really useful insights to help you think about what language you should use in your comms campaign, what influencers or key opinion leaders or digital opinion leaders, whatever you want to call them, to maybe engage with to help get that story out. Because we know you can have 2 articles published at the same time in the same publication, and one article could have 100 times as many people viewing it as the other, because that article has resonated online. It's got people sharing it. Publishers themselves as well are very aware of what people are doing on their sites. And if they see an article that they publish is not doing well, it gets kind of pulled from their front page where people go to that site and will find it. They'll take it off their digests. Whereas a story that's doing well, they'll keep it on there because they want eyeballs as well. So they are looking at which articles do well and which ones don't. And so we also need to be thinking about the shareability of that content. Obviously, we're not just going to try and link a post to some pop culture theme just for the sake of shares. We want to make sure that it hits the right audiences. But nonetheless, there are things that we can do with social listening that can help us understand within our target audience what sort of stories have worked in the last 3 to 6 months, a year. We can then factor that into our planning. When it comes to actually implementing it, obviously we need to then think about which hashtags maybe to use along, or which words to use in our little bit of text that we're going to put with the social posts, because that might increase significantly our chances of those stories being shared. And that's not just about what your social team are going to put on their tweets that maybe links to your press release or your story, because many publishers are also going to be taking a little snippet about the article and putting it on their platform. So you also need to be thinking about the publishers when they put your article into a headline or into a tweet. What words are they going to use? Because that can have a massive impact on then how many people actually bother to click on those links. So you've got to, you don't have control exactly on how they're going to do that, but you can be smart in how you put your headline together. And again, with all of this data that we've got online that's there, it just requires the right sort of tools and skills to analyze it. Massively powerful and impactful. So be aware of that. Also, when it comes to then measuring and evaluating it, make sure you're incorporating things like social shares in your coverage, because not every article is equal. You don't tweet 2 articles on the same publication equally. Obviously in print, one's on this page, one's on that page, it's probably going to have the same amount of people reading them, but online, completely different dynamic. So make sure you're factoring that into your evaluation of your earned coverage, but also then when people are talking about you, there's a whole range of emotion that gets expressed in social that you don't get in traditional news, that is important to incorporate in your measurement. So start to include metrics such as, like we saw with the example Barney showed of the Xbox and Nintendo piece, joy, how much people are actually using emotive language when they're talking about your brand. So sentiment isn't just positive and negative, it's going to be a whole range of emotions that people are talking about. And obviously then you want to make sure that you take your learnings from your evaluation into your next campaign. So let's go along to another example of this. So big topic in the UK, but also globally, is what businesses are doing about climate change. And so many of you on this call now, on this webinar now, will be involved in putting comms out about what your business or your organization is doing to help reduce your carbon footprint. So the question is, as a comms person, we're going to put out a press release. We're going to then have some social media to support that statement that we're going to put out about what we're doing as a business. What language should we use to make this announcement? So one question we got asked a lot at Brandwatch, especially 2019, should we go with the headline about committing to low carbon economy, or should we use the term net zero? Okay, because if you use one or the other, you could have a significant impact then on how much the article then gets shared and viewed online. So one of the things that we did was to look at how much people are talking about these terms online. So what you're looking at here is a timeline, and so similar to that kind of inflection point we looked at with the COVID stories example, but this is a timeline of online news articles using the phrase low carbon or net zero. And if we were to put this timeline back, further to 2016 or beyond, you see that that net zero line is a very, very slow line, just a couple of tiny little peaks. And generally speaking, low carbon has been substantially above it. But then 2019, we saw in the UK a change. So that change then happened around about June, where you started to see the term net zero appear more in online news. And then it's gradually grown. But low carbon has also continued to increase in online news coverage. But when we switch to looking at the discussion on social, just pop ahead a slide. Similar but different story. First of all, key thing is that the inflection point between when net zero started to be used more than low carbon happened about 6 weeks earlier on social than it did in news. So people were talking about net zero more than low carbon before it started to happen in the news. The other big thing is that the gap has widened. In social, the conversation on low carbon has stayed pretty flat throughout the last 2 years, whereas net zero has grown. So in the previous chart, it's ended up around about in June this year, a kind of 2-to-1 differential of net zero to low carbon in online news, whereas in social, it's about a 7-to-1 volume difference. Why? Well, first of all, what caused the inflection point? In 2019, the UK government made an announcement that they wanted the UK as a country to be net zero by 2050. And actually in the global conversation, about a third of the net zero mentions are from the UK. So it's actually a particularly big conversation driver in the UK versus other countries. And what we've seen then is loads of other people, there's also local elections in May. So loads of political leaders got involved in the net zero discussion. Loads of campaign groups were celebrating this and saying more needs to be done faster. And then importantly, lots of brands started to come out with statements to say how and when they were going to hit their net zero target. So just going to pick ahead to the next slide. We can then see how the conversation varies between the two conversations. So when we saw social conversations about net zero, a lot of it was about brands coming out with statements, organizations, universities, all sorts of different groups coming out with statements about how they were going to support that UK drive to be net zero by 2050. Some brands saying they wanted to be net zero well ahead of that timetable, whereas low carbon was more kind of talking about just more general topics. And if you pop ahead to the next slide as well, what we can see is that lots of people were then expecting brands who hadn't made a statement about net zero to make a statement. So these supermarkets have all said when they're going to be net zero, hey, why is this supermarket not done so? Come on, what's your story? Why are you not joining in? And we also then saw a mix of different types of hashtags being used. Obviously, Extinction Rebellion, you can see that on the list there, were very active, saying not enough was being done, but at least gather something was being done. And then you had hashtags like Fly Net Zero being used in the aviation industry. So from a comms point of view, again, think about what language you should use when you're putting out a press release. Have a look on social. Have a look at how the different terms that you might use are being used now. What is the trajectory? If you can see that there's option A is kind of flatlining and option B is ticking up, you might want to bet on option B as your term that you're going to use, like net zero as being the kind of headline rather than low carbon, because that will probably result in you getting more coverage, more people talking about it, showing that you're more kind of, in sync with what other brands are doing as well. So that's hopefully a useful example of this net zero conversation. You can just pop ahead. Another thing, this is going a bit more into detail and kind of planning, is vaccines. And so this is an example of some work we did to help a healthcare company plan comms to encourage people to get vaccinated. So this is then looking at people online talking about vaccines and whether they want to get vaccinated, whether they're worried about getting vaccinated. And so you can see a kind of trend over time from, this is looking at the whole of 2020, and we split the audience down into different groups. So we looked at people saying that they will get vaccinated, people saying they wait and see, those who say they're unsure, and those who are saying that they won't now or they won't ever. So we can then look at how those different groups talk about vaccines and what their concerns are, what might be holding them back, what are they waiting for, and what are they waiting to happen in order for them to change their mind. And again, with you may not be in health, you probably won't be in health actually on this call, there's lots of different people. There'll be something like this that's relevant where you need to change perceptions about your brand, you need to change perceptions about a public issue, if you're a government body or a charity. Have a look at different ways to segment that. We can, in social, look at different groups and try and segment them based upon their viewpoint or upon their other kind of things that might be male, female. Obviously, there are some limitations to do with GDPR that we can and can't do, but where we can, there are different segmentations we can use to understand how different groups online think and what they're saying and sharing with each other. So you can pop ahead, Mike. So this was then looking at those different groups, what are the key priorities for them? So you can see, for example, those saying that they will get vaccinated, they were actually talking about social responsibility being a much more important theme for them. And I can pop ahead again, just a couple of questions. This was then looking at what people then were stating as being the reasons that they were worried about. And we can pop again, actually, and share some of these slides afterwards. So 5 quick tips just to leave you before we get into some Q&A. The last few years, I've mainly been working with people in digital marketing roles, social insights roles, consumer insights. And quite often when I'm talking with them, we're looking at influencers or we're looking at different audience groups. And I'll say to them, oh, obviously we've got different types of people that are important. What about your journalists? Obviously there's media people, and these people in digital marketing roles will tend to say, oh no, the PR team have that. They deal with the journalists, right? So we don't really look at that. And I'm kind of surprised. I'm thinking, well, shouldn't you in the digital marketing team or the insights team have that information from the comms team? Shouldn't the comms team have shared that information with you? So when you're out there doing campaigns, you're just listening to social, who the people are that really matter in the media world. The people that your comms team have already spent lots of time figuring out who's who. And your comms team have got maybe decades of experience in knowing all the important journalists, and they've got their own list. So make sure, as a very minimum, especially if you've got two different social listening tools, so you might be in the comms team using one tool for media monitoring that's got some social capability, maybe a digital team has got a different social tool, or even if you're both in the same tool but using different dashboards, just make sure it's a very simple thing. You're sharing your list of journalists and other key opinion leaders with everyone who's actually involved in listening and analyzing social, because that's a very important lens that can also be really crucial for getting any alerts. If there's a crisis, they can probably pick up an important stakeholder group for you and the comms team talking about an issue. Another thing as well is, if you haven't done it already, is to map the influencer circle around your core set of journalists and other influencers, so that you are, you've got your journalists, as we've seen earlier in this conversation, very active online. They're talking to each other, but they're also not just talking to journalists. They're talking to academics, campaigners, politicians, a whole range of people, consumer advocacy groups, so on and so forth. So if you don't already know who those other people are that are influencing the journalists that you care about, make sure you properly map that out, so you can join the dots between all these stakeholder groups, because they are talking to each other. The other thing as well, especially on Twitter, where we know journalists spend a lot of time, so KOL stands for key opinion leader. Sometimes it's a digital opinion leader, or people call them an influencer. So yeah, different terms get used, basically the same thing. So online, the way that Twitter algorithm works is, if you are on Twitter and you're looking at your feed, Twitter will send you posts, and they will often favorite or show preferential treatment in your feed for people that you've engaged with before. So if a journalist logs into Twitter, they are more likely to see posts from people that they have engaged with before. So if you want to get an idea of what a journalist that you care about might be seeing when they log into Twitter, you need to get an idea of the community that they're engaging with, because that's probably going to be the sorts of posts that they will be seeing in their feed, because that's the way the Twitter algorithm works and serves up content to them. So important to be mindful of them. Sorry, what is a key opinion leader? Okay, sorry, that's someone who is online and just very influential. They're important, so they could be a politician, they could be a leader of a business, or they could be a more kind of traditional influencer, but someone with lots of followers. So the reason the word key opinion leaders is used is something that might be someone who actually only has a very relatively small number of followers, but they're very important in their network. They're influential in their peer group. So like if you're a technical business, or you're a B2B firm, your influencers or key opinion leaders may not be considered influential at all by a B2C brand who only thinks an influencer is someone with 100,000 followers. Okay, so that's just why, just effectively I'm saying anyone who matters online to your business, that's a kind of a K-role. So then the third point is just to make sure, if you haven't also done this already, social is a great cost-effective and time-efficient way of getting an insight into what people are saying generally about your industry and about your competitors, your peers. So at least once a year, try and do just a broad listening exercise where you just don't look at your own mentions, your own coverage, or your key competitors. Broaden it out. Try and get a sense of what are the bigger long-term trends in your space, because that's going to be important for your planning. Also, make sure, the fourth point here, you're also analyzing how people are reacting to your content and your competitors. So again, if a competitor wants to come out with a bold statement about something, like some kind of CSR initiative, and you're thinking, oh, we need to also make a similar statement, right? Well, we're not quite sure how to do it. If your competitors or your peers or other brands that not in your sector are coming out and doing it, you can observe how people react to those statements, and then see whether they've done it well or not. And you can learn from that in how you then go and make your own announcements. So maybe things that you might want to avoid doing because someone else has made the mistake for you. And final point, kind of mentioned this already, but make sure that in your coverage, when you're doing your media analysis, to factor in share data. So when you've got all these articles that hopefully said good things about you, which ones were shared more than others? Because that's going to be a much better indicator of what stories people are actually reading about you. So it's not just about getting the coverage in the right publication, it's making sure that those articles are actually engaged with and read by people. So those are just 5 hopefully straightforward tips, and we're happy to talk offline about this more, but those are 5 things that I would recommend that all of you are doing. So get together, if you're a social person with the comms team or vice versa, and make sure that these things are happening in your business. That's it for me. Back to you, Barney.
Awesome. Thanks, Alistair. And thank you, everyone. I think with a little bit of time left, we'll end that part of the discussion and kind of move on to some of the audience questions. There's going to be a recording of the session made available to everyone, so you'll be able to see slides on that. I'm sure if you reach out to us, and I don't mind sharing slides with people. Going into some of the questions that we've got, I think we've got some interesting questions. One question specifically around kind of identifying, audiences. I think we talked about that example with Xbox and Nintendo. I think we've got a question around how you would go about kind of finding a specific audience for a game, for example. So I'll talk through an example. Maybe if I was EA and I was looking at finding fans for FIFA, right? Then what I can look to do, there's kind of a few ways you can go about that, but with tools like Brandwatch, what you can do is you can search the Twitter bios and the content that people are producing on Twitter for particular keywords or particular pieces of information. So in that case, what you could search is, you could search for everyone whose bio contains, FIFA or EA or FIFA and gamer, things like that. You could also search for people who are frequently tweeting about FIFA or FIFA and gaming, etc., to then pull together an audience of people who you can maybe define as your fans for that particular game. And then once you've got that audience, you can overlay it over any kind of query that you have. So you can look at all content for FIFA and see how much of that is from that engaged group of fans that you have. Alistair, anything to add on kind of identifying those audiences?
Yeah, I think so. With audience analysis, is when you look at a topic or a brand being talked about online, the way you can look at audiences is sometimes people put something in their bio, and you can get kind of good of analysis just of kind of clusters of terms that people use in their bio. And so you can have a kind of a preset audience approach where you, as a team, have already got your own predefined audiences, and you can then try and apply those to the conversation. The other useful thing is to try and actually get a kind of an organic audience analysis. Say, right, well, let's not come necessarily with our own predefined segmentations, but let's just see if there's any new kind of clusters that come up in the conversation. So all these people talking about is, oh, there's some commonality in people talking about our brand who have this in their bio, or they also talk about these other things a lot. That could be really insightful and really useful to know that maybe there's a missing segment that you haven't really catered for. So that's, I think, two approaches. One is to have your kind of predefined segment, to try and then think about how would that particular audience describe themselves, and then you can apply those. And I don't need to go into the details now, but basically you create a rule. So, right, if they say these certain things in their bio, then they kind of categorize into that group, or they say these things in their post, they categorize into that group. But the other thing is to let the kind of the data speak for itself and take a kind of organic approach and say, right, well, let's see if there's any new segmentations that we haven't thought about that we can see from the conversation.
Yeah, great. And then next question we've got, Alistair, if you want to maybe talk on this, is a question around maybe how frequently companies should be sharing earned coverage on socials. So the example is, if we've got positive reviews for a book or for whatever it might be, how frequently might you be sharing that kind of content on your social platforms?
Yeah, so again, this is a thing of who to share and where to share. So, and this is also again where, the having a kind of a finger on the pulse of what's going on online is so important. So if you have got positive coverage about your brand, one thing you can do is obviously to post about that coverage on your main channels. But actually, probably it's better if that is done by employees, really, as part of a kind of an employee advocacy exercise, because that's probably more likely to get shared further on. Social is meant to be really people to people. So I think often those sorts of sharing exercises work better when it's done more organically through people. And again, don't just look at that as being a thing of, we are sharing our own content. Sometimes you need to earn the right to speak. So that's also maybe part of a kind of a longer term strategy to think, well, how can we build up good connections with communities that we think would be receptive to our content, and also content that's positive about us? If we want to do that, we also need to be thinking about content that's actually just going to be interesting and beneficial to that group. So if you listen to the key audiences or the key influencer networks that you are trying to connect with, and you see what they share, what works with them, what they like to engage with, that's going to be a much more natural conduit to then put, articles that are saying good things about your brand. So I'd say it's best to be done as a kind of person-to-person level rather than a kind of pumping it out on your brand channel. But it's still okay to from time to time put positive coverage on your brand channels as well.
Yeah. Great. And then kind of a couple of questions. I think one of the first ones I'll talk about a little bit is where we see LinkedIn. Now, LinkedIn is really difficult to get data for LinkedIn because Microsoft have decided to not allow people to publicly access a lot of that data. They've obviously made that decision for reasons because they wanted to avoid some of the challenges that other social companies have had around data availability, things like that. You can still get a lot of information from your owned LinkedIn profile and the data you can get from LinkedIn for Business, things like that. And I think LinkedIn is a fantastic platform, particularly for B2B organizations. So, I can talk a little bit about myself and Cision. If I go on Twitter, I have a lowly 200 followers, something like that, a lot of which are interested in sports or cricket, some of which come from a media background. Whereas if I go to my LinkedIn, I've got over 500 connections. That's a very focused audience on my particular work that I do at Cision. So if I want to get messages out there or have conversations, for a lot of B2B companies, LinkedIn is super important. I think something that definitely you should be thinking about using in your combined social planning. And then a kind of question on how we would define the different content roles between PR and marketing within social media. I think one of the things that's certainly happening is earned media teams and marketing teams are getting closer together and are starting to work closer together, but they are still different skill sets that need to be looked at. So if you are, for example, creating earned media content, that is a different skill set to like creating a YouTube video. It's a completely different skill set. And I think what you'd want to do is make sure that you have people in those teams who have those particular skills. So again, I relate things like this to internal examples that I can give. Doing analysis of social media and YouTube is slightly different to doing it of traditional earned media. So we have people who will cover the full spectrum of analysis and insights for our clients, but you do have people who have specialisms within social, within YouTube, within traditional analysis. And I think you'd want a similar kind of setup for internal comms teams where you're all working collaboratively and have an aligned approach so that messaging, etc., is consistent, but you have people who are best at creating content for different channels. Alistair, do you want to add thoughts there?
Yeah, no, just that last point you made is crucial. So make sure that this is done in a joined up way. And also it's important to be mindful of timing, because often what happens with content is that some content can be created in a very kind of heads down way. There's some big piece of content, either it's a comms driven press release, or back in the days when we actually had people sat in a room and listening to an announcement, or it's some very carefully choreographed marketing exercise. If it's done in a kind of a heads down mode where it's just going to work on the content, publish, and then suddenly you think, oh, whoops, actually there's something else going on right now. Maybe now wasn't the best time to say that because something else is going on, and whoops. So just make sure that, if especially if it's some bigger kind of long piece that's kind of ramping up to then have a big kind of fanfare announcement, just be mindful to kind of get your head up and listen and say, is this really the right time? Yes, okay, the coast is clear. Let's get this announcement out. There's no kind of big disaster kind of ready to hit us. And this announcement is going to look really out of sync with what's going on in the public discourse. So do have an ear to the ground as well.
Yeah, I think we've got 60 seconds left and a few questions, so I'm going to we'll try and do lightning round on these and answer them really quickly so we can get through the last few questions that we have. Alistair, I'm going to throw this to you though and put you under pressure. How would you capitalize on trending news articles without it appearing too much like newsjacking?
Yeah, I think one of the key things there is to think about, having the right angle, because sometimes what can happen is, as a business or as an organization, you care about one particular thing, and then suddenly that thing is the topic of the day, and you absolutely think, well, this is a golden opportunity for us to get some attention to this thing that we've always been interested in. So I think as long as it doesn't look like you're just suddenly trying to jump into a theme that you've not had any kind of history in, and it's something that, as a business, you've always cared about, and you're saying, right, well, now that everyone's focusing on this topic, actually, hey, we're here as well. That, I think, is fine. If it's some really kind of weird, kind of nonsensical link to try and jump on a topic, that's, I think, where I'd stay away from it. So as long as you've got a kind of a legitimate right to speak into the topic, and you're not just trying to jump in because it's popular, then I think you're okay.
Yeah, definitely. I think that point's really important on, like, it needs to be a conversation you're frequently in already, otherwise it will just come across as disingenuous. Last couple of questions really quickly. Sharing earned media on social media platforms, is an NLA license needed to do that? Depends, unfortunately. Now, sharing URLs, things like that is fine. Obviously, what you can't do is share a full print article from the Financial Times on your Twitter feed, because the Financial Times are not going to be happy about that, because they want people to go and buy the newspaper. I think one of the things here that is important is, like, if you have earned media coverage that has, the Guardian's written a piece about you and you want to amplify that news, like, talk to the Guardian about it and say, hey, can you post this on your socials? We want to amplify it. Like, your relationship with those publications should extend beyond just the one-on-one journalist relationship where they're producing content. And then
again, you think, if you've got your team, your people sharing these articles, you're on much safer ground as well. So again, if this is done as a kind of a employee advocacy or kind of wider networking exercise, then your teams, rather than your brand sharing these articles, is going to be much safer as far as any kind of copyright concerns are, because it's people sharing links of articles that they want people to read in the network.
And then the very last question, what approach would you suggest for comms people with clients who are reluctant to invest resources in social media? I would, of course, say this because I'm a data person, but get the data to show them that they're wrong, because they are wrong. And there is plenty of data for, hopefully, competitors within their space, but certainly for other brands, where you can see that by having a combined approach to social and etc., they will achieve worse results. And even maybe outside of that, there's lots of awards entries, award successes, which will generally be publicly available, where you'll see people having that success. It is very clear to me, from being in this industry for 8 years, that the future is this integrated, aligned approach. And I think everyone wants to be at the forefront of that. If you're a laggard to that, then you're going to be chasing articles when maybe relevance of certain media publications is on the decline, relevance of social platforms is on the incline, etc. So hopefully you can get data to show them that they're wrong. But Alistair, I'll let you have the final thought or word on that.
Yeah, and as I say, it's a false split. There isn't this thing of there's a kind of media world and the social world. My job as a person is to get coverage. Right? The whole point of the coverage is so that you think people are going to read that coverage and they're going to change their behavior. So, any comms person who's genuinely, professional, should be thinking about the ultimate goal, which is that people are reading these articles. The coverage is a means to an end. So if you care about eyeballs on those articles and people's views being changed, their behaviors changing, social isn't just about then the separate thing of you want people talking about your social. Listening and doing all the stuff we just talked about can help you get better coverage and also have coverage that's more likely to get read. And to have journalists who are more likely to bother to run your story. So, looking at the social domain isn't just about getting more social coverage, because that's someone else's job, right? It's about actually doing your job as a PR person better and getting better coverage, getting more coverage, and getting the right sort of response to that coverage.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we managed to whistle through all of the questions that we had there. Thank you to everyone who's able to join us today. So thanks to Alistair for bringing all of his expertise in the social world. It's been great having you. And if you'd like to find more about PR and social insights for your brand, then obviously please get in touch. You can get in touch either through the Cision UK and the Brandwatch websites. Feel free to reach out to myself and Alistair either on Twitter or LinkedIn. Happy to continue these conversations or answer any questions that you maybe didn't get answered during the session. We'd absolutely love to hear from you. But with that, I will just say thank you all for your time. Hope everyone has a great rest of the day.
Thank you.